Aloha y'all and welcome back to my channel. And today we're going to be doing, are you okay baby? Ophelia just walked past and bumped into the tripod. But today we are going to be doing another installment of my disappointing makeup releases series. I started this out just doing like the most disappointing makeup releases in 2020 because 2020 had a lot of duds. But today, and I believe I've done another one where I've not focused on 2020, if I remember, which most of the times I don't, I'm trying to get better. I will leave link down below the previous installments of this series. So today we've got quite a few things to go over. Obviously, like I try to preface with any kind of a talky discussion type video, if I talk about a product that has been released that is your favorite, your end-all be-all, absolutely holy grail, that is fan-tucking-fastic. You keep doing you, boo-boo. These are just my personal opinions on some products that I think probably could have been executed a little bit better. These are some things that sort of underperformed in varying ways. I feel like I should start off with the first item I put on this list, and the first item that I kind of really came to my mind of something that is a lot more recent than some of the other things on this list. But Melt Cosmetics, which is a brand that I absolutely love. As of filming right now, my Mary Jane palette is coming. It's on its way to me. There will be a review of that. But for the most part, Melt had palettes and releases that I bought. I bought the Amor Eterno one. I did the Beetlejuice. We did 420. Out of all the palettes that they've released, this is the first one that I didn't just like immediately get up and buy to review for a couple different reasons. But we are talking about the release or the re-release of their repackaged Blueprint palette. Well, the Blueprint stack that they turned into a palette, which is a theme that we've seen before from Melt Cosmetics. They have quite a few palettes that they have taken their infamous stacks and turned them into more conventional, less bulky packaging, which a lot of people were really excited about. I had a lot of y'all be like, I'm so excited they're turning this shit into palettes because I never wanted to buy the stacks because as someone who has some of the stacks, they're pretty cumbersome and kind of not the most user-friendly. And so when they came out with the Blueprint, I remember it was teased and I was like, one of y'all bought me that stacks. It's one of my favorite things that I have that one of y'all have sent to me. So I already had the Blueprint. And when they teased that they were going to be turning it into a palette, I was like, all right, this is going to be great. This is going to be so good. This is going to be a nice extension to this grungy, neutrally browny blue sort of contrast here. I was ready to see what they were going to do with that.
And then what they did with it is they literally took the shades out of the Blueprint stack and put them in an eyeshadow palette.
I was hoping that they were going to take it and put it into one of their large ones. We have the two sizes that they tend to do. We've got the Gemini size, and then there's the She's in Parties size, which was a much better done taking a stack and putting it into a palette than the Blueprint was. And it was just one of those things that I'm like, that's all we're doing? That's the best we can do? Because for people who already have the Blueprint stack and maybe wanted something a bit more easily dealt with,
they're not going to be buying this palette because they already have the Blueprint shade. So it's like you're making them buy it because you're putting it into new packaging, but you're not giving them anything new aside from making it easier to deal with. Like, if they had taken it and at least put it into one of their larger ones, they could have added so much to it. They could have given us a really much more cohesive and thought out color story. And it really frustrates me when you have these companies making releases and they're doing sort of a bare minimum. And I'm not saying the Blueprint eyeshadows, that whole thing in and of itself isn't beautiful. I have it. I really enjoyed it. But they had the opportunity to really turn it into something beautiful, something extra, something even better than the original. And instead of doing that, they just decided to plunk it in one of those 9-pan palettes,
give us some eyeliners, give us some whatever things, and be like, all right, it's the new Blueprint collection. I was sorely underwhelmed by that. And that is the first palette by Melt Cosmetics that I didn't just buy. I bought the Millennial Pinks palette faster than I would have bought this. I haven't bought it. I don't have it. Because I was thinking about buying it to review, but I'm like, why am I buying it to review it when I already have it, you know? It just didn't make a lot of sense for me. And it was just one of those things where I'm like, all right, they're going to come out with another palette. They're going to take this color story. They're going to extend it and they're going to make it beautiful. And I mean, it looks nice and it's all kinds of pretty, but it's also like, you could have done so much more. You could have added something. Like, I understand repackaging has been an important thing that they've been doing to, I don't know, rebrand or make it different. But when you're just repackaging, I mean, don't make that big of a deal out of it. Be like, hey, we're taking these shades we literally already have in this palette and we're just repackaging. Don't be like, ooh, Melt Cosmetics is releasing another palette, because they're not releasing another palette. They're releasing shades they had in palette form. It's not that exciting. It's not that interesting. It shouldn't receive so much hype. Only they had done just a little more to it, I wouldn't be so salty. Okay, let's talk about one that was also from 2020. It's funny how I'm like, oh, I'm gonna be talking about older things. We're talking about things from 2020. This is a palette that I actually purchased. This is the Natasha Denona Triochrome palette, which I will leave my review down below. Trying to remember if I did Get Ready With Me. Don't think I did, but if I did, we'll leave that down below as well. Looking at this palette, I wanted it to be all sorts of something. Admittedly, the only reason I bought it was because, was it 20% off? There was some kind of sale that made that shiz not $129. I mean, I'm sure I still paid way too much for it even on sale. But I didn't go in on that thing being like, I'm totally gonna pay $129 for this shiz. And I got it and I'm like, it's got such nice colors. I don't even have to insert a picture. I got that shiz right here. You know? It's got the grungy green, it's got the purples, it's got the kind of peachy orange. Yeah, they're a little bit desaturated for what I typically go for, but it had potential. You've got these three shimmers right here, best thing in the entire palette. If she chooses to formulate more shimmers like this, I'll be fine with it. If she chooses to formulate more mattes like this, I won't be as happy. Because the mattes, this is not an entire thing I regret buying, but it's definitely something that isn't worth the price I paid for it. Even, I mean, let alone the price it was $129 for this is a bit of an insult. And I say that because, and as I always say about digital comparison, I have her $65 palettes, which are one of the most immaculately formulated formulas that I've ever used. I put her $65 palettes up there with Viseart. They're better than Too Faced. They're better than Urban Decay. They're better than Tarte. They're better than Smashbox. You know, I would put those, I mean, I'm just like, buy those. Don't buy Huda. Don't buy their better than Jeffree Star. And so it's one of those things where when I'm used to that kind of quality for $65, when you give me this for $129, like, that's not okay. Do your testers not compare? Like, when you're getting this on the market, you're like, okay, all right, well, the mattes are okay, but they're not like bomb diggity shiznit quality like our $65 ones. How can you send this out when you have such beautiful formulas already on the market? And then you're like, I'm going to take this subpar formula and I'm going to put $129 on it. I would have been less upset if it was a $65 palette. I would have been a little bit disappointed because I've been like, these mattes are not what I'm used to. The shimmers are absolutely stunning. Absolutely immaculate. Gorgeous. Just these three shimmers are some of my three favorite shimmers to ever exist. I need to use them more. I should have used that one today. But the mattes, they're not bad. They're not bad. But like I said, for $129, it's like, I don't like advocating for bougie expensive makeup just for the sake of it being bougie and expensive. I love my Viseart Grand Pro 3 and it is expensive.
expensive, but it's also formulated basically immaculately and perfectly, in my opinion. And so then when you take something at that price point and then you look at this price point, you're just like, you could have been, if the mattes had just been better, I wouldn't be so butthurt about this. It's like the mattes were an afterthought to the shimmers, you know? It's like there just wasn't as much thought put into it. They're like, okay, we formulated these three great, amazing, crazy shimmers. We just got to throw some correlating mattes into this thing to make it more cohesive as a palette on a whole. There's some shades that I like. I like the, what is this? The manganese shade. I'm having a stroke. I like the tungsten. I love vert. I love ion. You know, there's some really pretty shades up in here, but it's just the fact that it could and should have been so much more. I will probably never buy another 120. Just the fact that they had the audacity to say this is $129 quality. It's not even $65 quality for the entirety of the palette. Shimmers, absolutely fantastic, amazing. Highly recommend not going out and buying this for $129, but maybe try it from someone who has it. But do not go out and buy this for $129 just for those shimmers, and that's the best thing in the palette. All right, now that we've talked about those things, we're now going to go a little bit back in time, not too far, but to a time when Kat Von D was still a part of KVD. A time when things were really struggling for her, and a time when there were some questionable releases. The first of which being the Lolita Por Vita palette, which is funny because that palette is how I learned to never actually read about yourself on Reddit. I don't even know why I was on there, but I was like, oh, look at this. Or I think maybe one of y'all sent it to me with like the best intentions. We're like, look, people are talking about you on Reddit. And what they were talking about is they were talking about the fact that I had a subscriber send me the Lolita Por Vita palette, and they're all like, well, she actually bought it and her nose is too big and she's stupid for thinking that we're stupid for thinking that someone sent it to her. I like went through the whole thing and I just closed down the app and was like, we're not doing that again. That wasn't fun. So if you're someone who's got some kind of do not talk about yourself on Reddit. But back to the palette. This palette, I was so hopeful for it. You all know that at the time, I was like, all right, come on. I wasn't purchasing from KVD, and maybe that was why people were salty, because I anti-hauled it. And then they're like, well, she reviewed it anyway. And I'm like, yeah, but I didn't spend my money on it. But anyway, as I was saying, looking at this palette, you're like, okay, all right, we've got some things that could potentially be good. You all know that I love the whole concept and the color story of Lolita. The little 9/8 pan palette that she did of that, I reviewed it. I gave it fairly good reviews. And if I remember, I will leave down my reviews of these palettes if I have them. But looking at it, you know, it had beautiful typography. It had a fairly good level of gradation, but on a whole, as sort of what I considered was going to be a comeback palette, it really underperformed. It underperformed color theory wise. It underperformed in the sense of what it could have been. Those big giant things of shimmers that you think, oh, this is going to be my end all be all. This is going to F me up. They were so difficult to work with. You'd swatch them and you're like, holy heck'em. And then when I went to apply that shiz on my eye, I might as well have been working with absolutely nothing. I might as well have been just like getting some air with my brush and trying to apply that to my lids, because that is how they were to work with. I used them with different brushes. I tried a glitter glue and a tacky primer. I tried every which way, and I could not get that stuff to work. And I felt so sad about it, because I'm like, this is going to be so great. This is going to be what we need. And it just wasn't. I also had a lot of people butthurt who was like, well, you're just talking about Kat Von D because it gets you views. And I'm like, I mean, I'm talking about whatever it is I'm talking about. And I'm like, it's not that I don't want to get views. That's the one thing that confuses me. When people are all like, well, you're only doing this to get views. And I'm just like, isn't that part of the, isn't it, you know, the more views I get, the better?
I didn't think I was clickbaiting or nothing, but back to the palette.
It was just one of those things that really kind of, you know, I mean, the nails were going into that coffin anyway, but this was a really big nail. And it just left me feeling so underwhelmed and so disappointed. And I was just like, this is sad. It could have been so much better. And then if we're talking about KVD, Kat Von D products that could have been so much better, I would be negligent to not include the Fetish collection. Both of them, the eyeshadow palette and the blush palette. And I gotta admit, I was angry about the eyeshadow palette, but I was so butthurt about the blush palette because the aesthetic of that lighter colored bondage theme and the whole, like, you know, the vanilla side of it and the shade's named Salem and it was Bathory. I was in it to win it. This was gonna be it, and it was formulated like crap. I was just like, come on, please don't be patchy. Why are you patchy? Why are you, it was awful. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. Had those chunky highlighters of hers that weren't formulated very good. It was just a disaster all around, and I was exceptionally butthurt about it. And then you have the eyeshadow palette, which again, aesthetically, pretty nice. I mean, reviewing this collection and roasting it was what made me get any of the subscribers I have now. Well, and the Fall of Kat Von D video. So please forgive me if I try to proc off the one thing that I've ever actually seen get me a significant amount of views. But this, you look at it, and yeah, the color story was kind of classical KVD holiday release, but it was, I feel, one of the most inconsistent, the most eyeshadow vomit she'd done, because the Satan Sinner one, yeah, it was disjointed, but I was able to do so many different kind of looks. I think I did it's one from the Sinner side, one from the Saint side, and then I did a look doing both sides. If I remember, we'll leave that shiz down below. And even those got good views for being like tutorials, and those get abysmal views on my channel. And so there was just so much expectation, I feel, for me, you know, and this was why I ended up doing the Fall of Kat Von D video, because it was just so not what I was used to. I was used to immaculate quality, beautiful, pigmented, blendable mattes, jaw-dropping shimmers with beautiful finishes, easy to use, and I basically got none of that. The only section that was somewhat viable was like the reds. And I mean, we already knew that she could formulate good reds. She's done it before. So it wasn't anything amazing that lended it. It wasn't like, oh, there's this super duper difficult, complicated shade to formulate. It was like, no, she's like, I know how to do this. And we're like, okay, yeah, we already knew that. And the palette just on a whole screamed almost unfinished. Like, it had great aesthetics and it had everything like that, but then the color theory and everything else that went into it just seemed so subpar. It was all kinds of reviewing that shiz, roasting it, opened it up into a whole new different kind of whatever on my channel. Okay, let's talk about one that's not one that I've bought or reviewed or ever had. Well, I reviewed the original one. Actually, I think I roasted it because I hated it. Either way, Morphe and James Charles, who had previously released the apparently end-all be-all, you can do everything with it, it's for everyone eyeshadow palette, which was supposed to be the replacement for the 35B, which we know that certainly wasn't the case. We've seen some of those being released recently, but it was a super, super hyped up release. It was sold out consistently. I remember agonizing about whether I wanted to review it because I'm like, I don't like James Charles. I don't like Morphe. But oh boy, is this palette supposedly the second coming of Jesus Christ in makeup form. So I bought it. I hated it. It sat in a drawer until I was able to declutter it to somebody. And then after such a monumental release, after breaking all sorts of records and being the palette everyone wanted to have, they were like, let's do round 2. And I'm sure a second palette would have sold significantly well. You know, if you look at the Jaclyn Hill second palette, that one did fairly well. But instead of actually curating a new color story or trying to create a different palette or go in a different direction, they decided that they were just going to take the pre-existing James Charles palette and make it small. Like, that's all they did to it. They were just like, they just went all Willy Wonka on this shiz and were like, we're just gonna make it smaller. It's gonna be the same. It's gonna be the same, but it's smaller. Unlike Willy Wonka, it was not the same when it came through again to the other side. The quality was significantly different and poorer. And this is coming from, a palette that I don't think had good quality. It's got great ratings. I don't know what happened to me. Maybe I just suck at makeup. But when they released this thing, it's really, honestly, you know how you have the sound heard around the world? Well, the sound that we heard when this was released was one big giant wah, wah, wah. Because it's taking a palette you already have, and then you're making it smaller, and then you're like, well, why did you do that? And they're like, well, we wanted to take into consideration my fans that don't have a lot of money. Maybe you should have taken that into consideration when you launched the first one? Because I think that palette was that palette $39? I'm trying to remember Morphe's price point. I know they're not like high end, but they're definitely not completely affordable. So you had that whole caveat going on where they're like, oh, well, it's for the people that can't afford this, for the people who want to travel with it. And I'm just like, this is the biggest load of bunk I've ever seen, and I'm not even a part of the fandom, as it were. And then the other thing that sort of teed me off and made it sort of disappointing, how shall we say, while he's here advocating for the fact that the release of this palette was due in part to the fact that he wanted to take into consideration his lower income fan base, because let's face it, 99.999% of his fan base are children. They're not exactly out there working the 9 to 5 and getting the money to buy expensive James Charles palettes. Gotta go to mom and dad. But while he was doing this whole, oh, it's affordable, at the same time as the mini palette release, he was like, I am going to also release this disgustingly overpriced brush set. I understand brushes are a very important part of the artistic process. I have gotten by using brushes that are, I think the most expensive brushes I ever bought years ago were 2 by It brushes for Ulta. Amazing. Love them. Would probably never pay that kind of price for brush again. I got Real Techniques, I got Wet n Wild, I got Essence. Up in here, probably the bougiest brand that I have in my brushes is Real Techniques. I got Wet n Wild, I got stuff I find at Marshall's. And so I admit, I'm probably not the fancy bougie overpriced brush demographic. But once again, I'm not that demographic because I'm not a child, Even if I wanted to, I could probably buy it. I'm in much more of a financial situation to be throwing money on lame brushes than a child is. So when there's part of you that's like, oh, because I'm trying to be like the lame reason for releasing this palette was because I want people to have a cheaper option, and then you kind of sidecar that release with an expensive brush set, it comes off as disingenuous. You released the palette because you wanted money. And there's nothing wrong with the hustle. If I was making money like James Charles, I would be hustling too, but I would like to think I would be hustling in a more truthful and sincere way. I'd want to be transparent, not kind of shady. So for many different reasons, this release was just, like I said, I'm not even a part of the fandom. I don't even get Morphe, James Charles. I could live my life, the rest of my life without them, and I would be fine. I would actually probably be better because I wouldn't be having strokes every time I talked about them. Okay. Then if we're talking about underwhelming, disappointing releases from influencers, we might as well talk about one that I bought, I reviewed, I said, hey, this is pretty good. And then upon closer inspection, looking at this and thinking about everything else and using it again, I'm like, yeah, maybe it wasn't that amazing after all. Hindsight do be 2020 up in here. And that is honestly, I was gonna talk about just the palette, but I feel like Tati Beauty on a whole,
aside from her vitamins, because I feel like that was very on brand with her. I got a really good friend, JD. He swears by them. So that sort of aspect of Tati beauty aside, I'm talking about her makeup things, her palette and the Blendiful, which I never got. I'm like, no, I don't know. No, I am not applying my liquid makeup with the puff. But the eyeshadow palette, which, I mean, looking at it, I have since decluttered it, actually. I don't know if I will have decluttered it by the time this goes up, but it's in my bin of things to be filmed to be decluttered. And if you're looking at this thing, I can understand where she was coming from. Like I said, I reviewed it. I thought it was pretty okay. But if you're looking at this from a more subjective light, if you're looking at it from a point, just a moment, I got it in that little bin of things I need to declutter in Tennessee. So if you're looking at it, I mean, it's not a bad palette in the sense of I thought the quality was pretty good. I enjoyed the mattes. This, I feel, is an exceptionally redundant sort of shade to have because as much shimmer as you pack in there with a matte, I have found, unless I use a very, 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 very particular primer, particular brush, and apply it in a very particular way, through blending and everything like that, those little shimmer flecks just go away. And they don't just go away in the sense of like they're just gone. They go away in the sense that they migrate down to your face. So unless you're doing a significant amount of baking or you've got a crap ton of powder down there and Jesus take the wheel, you're gonna have little sparkly flecky flecks all over your face. And I feel for someone, as now that I'm kind of, looking at things in a different light, I feel like someone who has such a reputation on the platform for being such a significant person within the beauty community, I probably would have expected something more, something different, something better. Because in concept, this is interesting. You've got the rose with the different finishes, the different textures, because I think this is called like the textured neutrals or something like that. Absolutely no idea. It just says Tati Beauty Volume 1. We have yet to see a Volume 2 from her, which part of me is like, yay, she's not pushing out products back to back. But at the same time, I'm like, aren't we due for a little something new? I know you've been kind of struggling recently, but So looking at it and being objective about it, it's just not a palette that really screams sustainability to me in the sense of this is a palette that I got and it was good. I like the quality about it, but it doesn't have any staying power in my collection, I'm not going to be reaching for this orangey shade with glimmer all up in it. I've got all these shimmers. I'm sure I have all of these shades. I like how it plays well together. I like how it kind of is a little bit cohesive. I hate the fact that we've got these pasty setting shades. The black is formulated really well. It's got pressed glitters. Probably some of the better pressed glitter formulas I've tried. I think I used this one as an inner corner highlight and I just about died. I may try to depot that shade because as a pressed glitter, that's one of the best things I've ever had. But on a whole, as something for her, it just doesn't scream to me something that lasts, something that's going to make such a significant impact. This isn't Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance. This isn't what Jeffree Star's Blood Sugar was. This isn't something that sets such a significant mark within what products have been released that it's going to be like, wow, this is the palette that is the next big thing. This is the palette that everyone is going to love and have and use until it dies. Color story wise, theme wise, it just doesn't have that going for it. And it was trying to do that. It was trying so hard to be this like fancy textured new sort of way of eyeshadow palette formation. It was trying to be the new cool kid on the block. And for a while it was. A lot of people talked about it, but just looking at it, it really is just a fairly basic color story made with some fancy little textures added in. And these ones, you don't even get to always see
the texture, like the little shimmer all up in there. You know, you don't always get that. The shimmers are good, you know, it's good. It's okay. But for something I would be expecting from a name like Tati, I mean, I'm not going to support Tati anymore. That's why I'm decluttering this. I have issues with her as a person, not so much as a content creator. And for someone who is a content creator who was and is so significant as her, this just, it surprised me how poorly it aged. Not in terms of formulation or anything like that, but like when you take into consideration the impact that the modern Renaissance had, or even the Norvina palettes. There have been so many different releases that have still managed to remain significant within the community, that are things that are getting repurchased, that are things that are still getting used. You know, I use the modern Renaissance as an example because that's a palette that had a huge impact on the community that people still talk about and use today. One of my end-all be-all favorite palettes is sitting right down there next to the Soft Glam. In comparison to that and other palettes that have been released, this one is just sort of, like I said, it didn't age well. It came out, it was fun, it was kind of gimmicky, people reviewed it, I reviewed it, and then now since release and looking at my collection, it just isn't enough for it to be what I consider a significant release. It's just another palette. Packaging, heavy, all kinds of amazing stuff like that, but on a whole, it's okay. It's all right. It's just another eyeshadow palette release. And I definitely expected something that was going to be more significant to me and my makeup routine, in all honesty. But I am going to end it there. I've definitely got other things I can talk about. This is probably going to be another series on my channel, that anti-hauls, that I'm going to be able to do and will do fairly frequently. Let me know down below some things that you think are some of the most disappointing or underwhelming releases in your mind. Ooh, I could do a video where you all submit underwhelming and disappointing makeup releases and I talk about those. Let me know if you guys would like to see something like that, and if you would, hit me up with your suggestions down below. You can message me on Twitter, message me on Instagram. You can message me on Snapchat, but that's kind of because the Snapchat makes the messages go away. Sometimes I'm not the best at that. But let me know if that's something you would think would be interesting. Also would love to hear what you have to say about the palettes I talked about. Like I said, if it's your end all be all absolutely amazing shiznit, that's amazing. I'm so happy for you, seriously. But thank you guys so much for watching. I love you, and as always, keep it real. Mwah!